My name is Han Chen, and my advisors to this work are Professor Qianzhong Shen and Professor Guangmo Tong. The title of my presentation is called Robust Blockchain Federated Learning with Decentralized Validation and Proof-of-Stake Inspired Consensus. Okay, in this presentation, I will present a preliminary work that aims to integrate the blockchain technology into federated learning framework to facilitate robust federated learning with two unique features that have explored the blockchain operations. The first one is a novel and decentralized validation method to validate the model before it's used to perform global model update of federated learning. And the second feature is a federated learning dedicated consensus mechanism inspired by proof of stake to consolidate the overall learning processes. We name this framework as Vbfl, as the framework is a validation involved blockchain federated learning framework. We will also show some experimental results that are based on real emulation, indicating that under some specific experimental setups, our work could effectively identify the adversarial learning devices and prevent their continuous attacks to the global model updates. Okay, so let's get started. At first, I wish to briefly introduce what federated learning is and what potential issues it has. So federated learning was presented to the public by some research scientists at Google in 2016. We would refer it as vanilla federated learning in this presentation. It is a distributed, yet still centralized machine learning setting where the goal is to collaboratively train a model with the training data distributed over a large number of learning devices. It is operated through communication rounds where during each round, the learning device independently compute an update to the current model based on its own private local data, and it communicates this update to the central server, where the learning device side updates are aggregated, or more specifically, averaged to construct a new global model. Then this new global model will be sent back to the learning devices to replace its local model, and the learning devices can begin the next communication round. So this figure shows an example of a real-world application of federated learning during one communication round. In this setting, each hospital is a learning device, and each hospital possesses its own private local training data, such as some patients' records. You could observe that their local data are illustrated in different shapes, different shapes, meaning that their local data is different from each other. They begin with locally training a model, such as a deep neural network that tries to classify, let's say, Alzheimer's disease based on brain images, and then upload the training updates to the central server to construct a new collaborative model. Excuse me. There are two popular federated learning algorithms for neural networks. The first one is called FedSGD. In this setting, sorry about that. In this setting, the local updates uploaded to the server are gradients learned from stochastic gradient descent. And the second one is called federated averaging, in which the local updates uploaded to the server are just the updated model weight. That is the whole updated neural network. In both settings, the central server will take an average of all the uploaded gradients or the model weights to construct the new global model, and then send it back to these 4 hospitals as their collaboratively learned global model. If they decide to continue training, the same process will be performed again. Federated learning is considered as a privacy preserving learning technique because the data of each learning device stays locally and only the local updates are exchanged. Though there are new research indicating that federated learning is vulnerable to model inversion attack, in which attackers may recover learning data from the global model, but that is outside of our discussion scope. Okay, so although federated learning is a promising technique for privacy-preserved collaborative training, it has the following 2 issues. First, apparently the learning is centralized, so the framework is vulnerable to single point of failure. If the central server is offline, then the whole learning processes have to abort. If the central server is compromised, which is more fatal, then the attacker can just send back whatever it wants for the global model update to disturb the learning process. And second, the local updates are not validated, so a malicious learning device can upload severely distorted model updates, such as opposite directed or randomly generated gradients or model weights to destroy the learned global model. Both attacks are able to cause deadly consequences for the patients when we apply a misshaped model for the final prediction. Therefore, addressing both issues is critical to robust and trustworthy federated learning. Any questions so far? We are good. Okay, to address the issue of single point of failure, a promising direction is to integrate blockchain technology into federated learning. It has proved its reliably decentralized operations in its famous Bitcoin application. Plus, federated learning and a blockchain system work. Federated learning and a blockchain system, they both work in some similar ways. For example, they all involve a distributed network, and the nodes in the network need a consensus from time to time. In fact, there are existing works that have explored the combination of these two techniques, such as the paper by Kim, published in 2019, in which they have proposed a blockchain federated learning framework termed as Blockfl. By utilizing the decentralized feature, Blockfl gets rid of the central server in federated learning and lets the learning devices exchange their local model updates recorded in the blocks. To make this work, Blockfl introduced miners role to receive the local model updates, broadcast them, and record them in their respective candidate blocks. Then miners would perform mining operations on their candidate block, that is proof of work, which is also the consensus used in Bitcoin to compete in appending their candidate blocks to the blockchain. By doing so, the local model updates are no longer uploaded to a single server, but multiple miner devices. The proof of work selects the miner who first finds the nodes that meets the current blockchain difficulty as the winning miner, and it uses the model updates in the winning miner's block to perform the global model update and concludes a communication round. In addition to decentralization, a blockchain system also brings the following two security features to robust federated learning. Firstly, the model updates are recorded in blocks, which are connected by a hash pointer and shared among all participating devices. A single bit of change of the block content will invalidate the whole chain, and a device can resync this chain from other devices. This feature provides reliable traceability of the whole learning process, which we believe may help in the field of explainable AI to some extent. As the blockchain is generated under a pre-agreed consensus mechanism, which is proof of work in Blockfl, the finally learned model is by nature trustworthy. Moreover, in proof of work, the ongoing training process is difficult to get hacked unless a malicious device has over 50% of the combined computation power of all other devices in the network in order to chase the entire mining operations to the latest point and replace the blockchain for the whole network. Although Blockfl has addressed the single point of failure of vanilla federated learning and added a couple of security features to enable reliable and trustworthy learning, it will still fail to identify a potential malicious learning device as it does not validate the model updates. As a result, Blockfl cannot prevent malicious learning devices from obstructing the learning processes. And we can observe such an impact in this figure, which is plotted based on our experimental results. Roughly speaking, the orange line shows an ideal learning curve of federated learning, in which you can see the accuracy is nearly 98% after communication round 80. However, if we let 15% of the learning devices inject the Gaussian noise to their model before uploading to the central server, the accuracy is observed to be fluctuating around 10 to 20%, as shown by this blue curve. The accuracy drop is almost 87% when only 15% of the learning devices are injecting noise. Therefore, it is essential to prevent malicious devices from participating in the learning process. The green line shows that with the validation mechanism of Vbfl, we are able to boost the learning accuracy from the blue curve to the green curve, and the details will be covered in the experimental results section. Any questions so far?
Okay. Yeah,
okay. Yes. In addition, although it is adverse to get hacked, proof of work may incur significant latency caused by the mining operations, which is not ideal for the overall learning process, let alone it is energy inefficient. Most importantly, proof of work is indifferent between selecting a malicious device and selecting a legitimate device as the vending miner, as it is majorly based on a device's hardware capacity plus some luck to be the first one in the network to find the nonce. In this case, if a malicious device is equipped with very high-end mining hardware, it is able to obstruct the learning process by continuously sending blocks containing the distorted model updates. Inspired by Blockfl and the other related work, we have proposed Vbfl, which introduces a third role called validator with a novel model validation method attempting to prevent the distorted model from being used in the final construction of the global model. The validation mechanism contains 3 parts. The first part is a voting action for local model updates by the validators based on a model validating mechanism. The second part is the voting results aggregation by the miners in the network. The third part is the blacklisting action of the devices that have been identified as potentially malicious by the aggregated voting results for a pre-agreed number of consecutive communication rounds. And the details will be covered later.
I have a question.
Yes.
How do you choose the validator, and if any entity can be a validator or not?
Any entity can be a validator. There is a role assigning mechanism for each device. The device must reassign itself as one of the 3 roles. One is worker, one is validator, and the other one is miner. It's randomly assigned.
Okay, so then for being, so this mechanism is a permissionless process, right?
Yeah, it is a permissionless so far.
Okay. Okay.
Thank you for asking.
Thank you.
Okay, so we have, So we have also designed a federated learning dedicated proof of stake inspired consensus mechanism for Vbfl, and we call it Vbfl Pos. Vbfl Pos aims to reward the learning devices that follow the legitimate local learning process and avoid rewarding malicious learning devices, which are voted as potentially malicious in the aggregated voting result. Therefore, a node in Vbfl Pos with a very high stakeholding indicates that it has made an outstanding contribution to the overall learning process. At the end of a communication round, Vbfl Pos would pick the winning miner based on the amount of a device's stakeholding. In Vbfl, a block contains the local model updates used to construct the global model during a communication round. Therefore, picking the block mined by a legitimate device is critical, as a malicious device may send a block containing fabricated model parameters to destroy the learning process. Proof of stake short for POS, is another popular consensus mechanism used in modern blockchain applications. It first appeared in 2012 and now is widely used in Ethereum. The core logic in POS of selecting the winning miner, as mentioned, is based on the amount of stake a node holds, which is the accumulated rewards a node has earned through blockchain operations. The node possessing the highest stake must have made the most considerable contribution to the network, so it is deemed the most trustworthy node in the network, with the least willingness to destroy the system. Therefore, Vbfl Pos exploits this attribute and select the winning miner that must have done many legitimate local model updates. Also, compared to proof of work, Vbfl Pos does not incur much latency, which is more suitable for efficient federated learning. And to aid the Vbfl Pos in selecting the winning miner, we have also implemented a role switching policy, which is simply reassigning the role of a participating device at the beginning of a communication round. That is related to the question just asked. It has at least these 3 benefits, but I will skip explaining them for now, as it will become much more evident once we have gone through the overall operations of Vbfl. Any new questions so far? Okay, please just interrupt me if you have any. Okay, excuse me. So now let's go through the overall operations of Vbfl. Vbfl is operated by a set of devices, capital D, with each device, little d, having its own training set and test set. Similar to banana federated learning, Vbfl also carries out learning operations through communication rounds. Each device little d is randomly assigned to one of the 3 roles at the beginning of each communication round: a worker W, a validator V, or a miner M. Sorry, here is a typo. Worker W plays the same role as a learning device in vanilla federated learning, and its primary tasks are performing local model updates and sending the updates to a validator V. A validator V obtains a local model updates, broadcasts the updates to other validators, and validates the received updates by the voting mechanism, which will be covered later. A miner M is responsible for aggregating the voting results and mining its privately generated candidate block containing those model updates and the corresponding voting results. The number of workers, validators, and miners add up to the number of total devices for a specific communication round. As you know, each device's role gets randomly reassigned in a new communication round based on role switching policy. Okay, before we begin, I also want to mention the attributes a device has. These 3 attributes, starting with an underscore, meaning those attributes are private. So other devices shall not see their values. The other attributes are public to the network, but only the device itself may change it unless it is compromised. So each device has an RSA key pair. This is public key and also a private key. And the device ID is just the device's public key and modulus. This is very similar to the Bitcoin system, in which the identity of a node is the hash of its public key. The public key will be used for others to verify the signature of transactions sent from this device. The second thing is the private key, which is used to sign its transaction, which will be explained later. The training and test sets of a device are private and shall never leave the device. So we preserved the privacy preservation feature of vanilla federated learning. The role attribute is used to identify itself to the network for device association, worker, validator, or miner. The stake tracker is used to track each device's accumulated rewards to correctly pick the winning miner on the Vbfl Pos. And the blacklisting tracker is used to track if a device is identified as potentially malicious for a number of consecutive rounds. And if so, the device ID will be recorded in its blacklist. There are also other pre-agreed common attributes of the device, such as neural network architecture, loss function use, and learning rate, and so on. Okay. Any questions so far? All right. Excuse me. Okay. Now, suppose we have 12 devices in the network, 5 plus 4 plus 3. And after the role assigning, we have 5 workers, 4 validators, and 3 miners in this specific communication round. Let's use some animations to go through the process. Sorry, excuse me. I have some chronic disease, so I keep coughing at winter. The communication round starts with the workers performing local model updates by training the global model constructed from the last communication round on their local training set by some epochs. Let's denote the finally produced local model update as L. We assume the federated learning algorithm used here is federated averaging. Therefore, the local model update L here is just the locally updated model weights. While performing the local model updates, a worker also calculates its learning rewards that is expected to be granted at the end of the communication round based on the rewarding mechanism defined in Vbfl Pos. The total rewards a worker is expected to be received is equal to the amount of the local training data samples times the local epoch number a worker performs for this learning. For example, if a worker has a training set with 100 data samples and it performed 5 epochs to update its local model, its expected rewards for this round would be 500. We denote the learning rewards calculated by the miner as R superscript W for this presentation. Also, asynchronously, a worker should associate with a validator and a miner at the beginning of a communication round, assuming all the devices work, all the devices, they know each other's IP addresses. This association can be random, or the worker can test for the connection strength between all the validators and itself, and choose the validator that has the fastest link speed to associate with. And the same association method goes for miners and workers as well. A worker has to use its own private key to send the hash of a tuple containing these 3 fields: the local model update, the expected rewards, and the device ID, which is the public key of this worker, to produce a signature. Then this worker will form a worker transaction which contains these 3 fields plus the signature, and send this worker transaction to its associated validator. Let's denote the worker transaction as WTX. Workers have to associate with miners to receive the legitimate block, which is the block mined by the winning miners from the associated miner at the end of a communication round. And I will explain what does it mean for a legitimate block at the end. Assume that W1 and W2 are associated with V1. W3 is associated with V4, and W4 and W5 associated with V3. As a result, W1 will send this worker transaction WTX W1 containing this 4 stuff to V1, and likewise for all other workers. On minus side, let's assume W1, W2, and W3 are associated with M1. W4, W5 are associated with M2. So W1, W2, and W3 will receive the legitimate block from M1. And W4 and W5 will receive the legitimate block from M2. Okay. After workers have sent their worker transactions, the workers have completed their jobs, and are waiting for the legitimate block from their associated miners. Now, when a validator receives a worker transaction from one of its associated workers, the validator will immediately broadcast this worker transaction to other validators in the network. For example, as W1 sends WTX W1 to V1. Upon receiving this WTX W1, V1 would immediately broadcast this WTX W1 to V2, V3, and V4. Likewise, V1 would do the same broadcasting for WTX W2 as well. V2, V3, and V4 have to follow the same broadcasting rule for their received worker transactions as well. By doing this broadcasting, each validator in the network would obtain all the available generated worker transaction in the network. And therefore, each validator can vote for every local model update from every worker. You may recall that D2 did not associate with any worker, right? But V2, but V2 would still get all 5 worker transactions from other validators. Okay. After validator V broadcasts a worker transaction, or upon receiving a broadcasted worker transaction from another validator, the validator V would first unpack the signature, the local model update, and the device ID. Notice that these 3 fields are not encrypted, so the validator can unpack their real values. And the validator then verifies the signature of this worker transaction by the worker's public key, which is just the device ID, as we mentioned before. The validator receives a verification reward by verifying the signature. If the signature is verified, the validator will go ahead and perform validation on the local model update LW by a voting mechanism that I will explain in the next few slides. And we will also discuss the situation subsequently if the signature is not verified.
I have a question.
Yes, go ahead.
Can you go back to previous slides?
Mm-hmm.
The previous one?
The previous one.
Yes.
Okay.
And also the previous one.
The previous one. Okay.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, just to be sure that I understood the model.
Mm-hmm.
So here we have 12 users in each round. Each of them randomly has a responsibility, a worker, a miner, or validator, so, right?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
So here, for example, this just a snapshot of one round. In this round, just 5 users are chosen as the workers. So it means that this round of learning is using the data of just 5 users.
Correct. Absolutely.
And so it means that the other users, the data of the other 8 users, 7 users are not do not have any role in their learning process of this round, right?
That's correct. Yes.
Okay.
But the validators will use their test data to vote for their local model updates, which are learned by their training data, and you will see that later.
Okay.
And because of the go ahead.
Okay, and then let's go to the 2 next slides.
Okay.
The next one. Okay, here the validator is receiving the ID and learning update from the workers and check to validate the results. So when I go through the validation responsibility, I see this validation is just verifying the signatures. So nothing more. So I mean that the validator do not check that if the learning update is correct or not.
That is checking inside of this validate by voting mechanism, which I will explain in the next few slides. First one, they have to make sure this signature is valid, right? If
Okay.
this signature is not valid, then it's not necessary to validate
Yes.
the local model updates. Yeah,
Okay.
but this is the first thing they perform.
Okay. In next round, you the validator check that if this update is correct or not.
Not in next round, in next phase, next step. Yes.
Okay.
Not
without any access to the data of the workers.
Without.
Okay.
No.
Okay. Good.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, let's go to. So yeah, that's all good for you, right? Okay.
Yes.
So let's take a look at this voting mechanism, which is the first part of the Vbfl validation mechanism. The voting mechanism I just mentioned after they do the signature verification, this step. Okay. Our proposed voting mechanism works like this. Let's just take V1 and W2 as an example. Before validating LW2, V1 would first perform a single epoch of local model update by training the global model constructed from the last communication round on its training set. And the global model constructed from the last communication round is the same across all the devices if their blockchain is in sync. Okay. So this training will produce a new model denoted as LV11. This one in the parentheses means it's produced by a single epoch. Then V1 would evaluate LV11 on its own test set to produce an accuracy denoted as a superscript V1 LV11. The capital A means accuracy. Superscript V1 means it's evaluated on V1's test set. Then V1 would evaluate LW2 on its own test set to produce an accuracy value denoted as a superscript V1 LW2. Notice here we do not care how many local epochs W2 had performed. So let's just take it as for granted at this moment. Then V1 would subtract a superscript V1 LW2 from a superscript V1 LV11. And let's denote this value as VAD, which is short for validation accuracy difference. Lastly, V1 compares VAD with the validator threshold value, denoted as VH superscript V1, and casts a vote for positive or negative for LW2. If VAD is larger than VHV1, the vote is negative, indicating that V1 thinks LW2 is in the opposite update direction of LV1, which also means that V1 thinks LW2 was illegitimately learned by W2. Otherwise, V1 thinks LW2 is in the same update direction of LV1 and casts a positive vote for LW2. I know it looks overwhelming and confusing, so let me explain what is the validator threshold value and the rationales behind this mechanism. So in order to validate a local model update, in this case, LW2, in this case, the local model update is LW2. Validator V1 may wish to compare these two values. Here, last G means the global model constructed from the last round, which is the same across all the participating devices. Therefore, AW2 last G means the accuracy value evaluated by the global model from the last round on W2's test set. And AW2 means the accuracy value evaluated by LW2 on W2's test set as well. Right. The reason for this comparison is that intuitively, if LW2 was legitimately learned from last global model, LW2 should bring some accuracy boost. Or if LW2 has converged, it may suffer from a little bit of accuracy drop intuitively. The validator V1 could then determine a validated threshold value, VHV1, as a tolerance of this accuracy drop. If this accuracy drop exceeds this tolerance, then V1 would regard LW2 as illegitimately learned and cast a negative vote. Otherwise, LW2 was regarded as legitimately learned, and V1 cast a positive vote for LW2. Notice that this validated threshold value should always be positive. So if this difference is negative, which means LW2 brings an accuracy boost. So V1 would regard LW2 as legitimately learned. However, sorry, as the data set of W2 never leaves W2, then V1 would have no reliable way to obtain AW2 last G and AW2 LW2. If W2 directly sent these two values to V1, V1 has no reason to trust W2 of sending the honest values, right? So any question? Does it make sense for this comparison? Okay. But there's a workaround for that. As V1 has last G and LW2, V1 can evaluate both of them. V1 can evaluate both of them on test set of V1 and get a V1 last G and a V1 LW2 as the proxy values of AW2 last G and AW2 LW2. Here we have assumption. Since V1 and W2 are two devices participating in this federated learning, then the data sets brought by these two nodes should follow a similar distribution. If this is true for both V1 and W2, then AV1 last G and AW2 last G should have a little difference in their values. Likewise, AV1 LW2 and AW2 LW2 should have a little difference in their values as well, right? Because you are training a neural network model by a similar distribution. Like you and me now are training on predict the Alzheimer's disease. So we have to train on brain images. But if you bring heart images, you bring lung images, the model will never converge. That's the assumption. Okay. Therefore, V1 could calculate AV1 last G minus AV1 LW2 and use this difference as the proxy difference to AW2 last G minus AW2 LW2. Okay. Then V1 compares this new proxy difference with its validated threshold value, which is the accuracy drop tolerance, and casts a vote by the same rule mentioned before. Notice that this validated threshold value must be between 0 and 1 because it's an accuracy drop measurement. So the least and the largest possible value are 0 and 1. Okay. So interrupt me if you have any question. And
so,
to see, yes, go ahead.
I actually have two questions. So first here, V1 has to train a global model in each round. Is it correct?
Yes, a global model in each round. And then the global model will be updated at the end of each round as well.
Okay. And the second question is, can V1 be compromised?
V1 can be compromised. And that's why we call it decentralized validation. And I will show you the effectiveness of that later. V1 can be compromised, yes.
Okay, but here V1 try to decide if W2 is compromised or not. Is it
yes,
correct?
V1 tries to decide if W2 is compromised or not. Yes. So V1 thinks himself as a legitimate learner at this moment.
So we assume, or like it could be.
Well, we assume.
Okay. Thank you.
We assume. Yes. Thank you. Okay. We implemented this method in Vbfl and see its effectiveness, but unfortunately, this method did not work as expected, and the difference value. Let's go back, and this difference value, AV1 last G minus AV1 LW from an arbitrary pair of V and W Here we shouldn't have V1 or W2. We should have just V and W. From an arbitrary pair of V and W, this difference seemed to exhibit an increasing trend as the communication round progressed. So it was very hard to catch that with a fixed validator threshold value. To explore the reason behind this failure, we ran federated learning using Fed averaging with 20 devices on MNIST handwritten digit classification, with each device using a MNIST CNN neural network architecture, which has 2 convolutional layers, with each followed by a max pooling layer. And the last 2 layers are a fully connected layer and a final soft max output layer. Each device performed 5 epochs of local model update during each communication round. The MNIST dataset is a collection of handwritten digits with the labels. We choose this dataset because it is public and has a long record of serving as benchmarks in machine learning. We logged the continuous learning accuracy of all 20 devices, and we arbitrarily choose one of them to draw its learning curve for the first 10 communication rounds. And also notice that in this setting, all 20 devices are performing legitimate learning. In other words, there was no malicious device. So this plot shows a legitimate learning devices learning curve in ideal federated learning. The y-axis indicates the accuracy. The x-axis indicates model checkpoint. G means global model, and the number after G indicates this global model is constructed at the end of which communication round. All other models labeled by LE represent the locally updated models. LE also means local epoch, and the number before LE indicates the communication round number, and the number after LE means this local model was learned after this number of epoch from the last global model. So for example, this 2LE1 represents the local model that was updated from G1 by 1 epoch. This 6LE5 represents the local model that was updated from G5 by 5 epochs. G9 means the global model constructed at the end of communication round 9. The blue curve connects the continuous test accuracy, including both the accuracy evaluated by the locally updated models and the global model. The test set used was the whole MNIST 10,000 data points test set. The orange curve connects all the global accuracies for all 20 devices actually. But here is just a one device's learning curve because the global model is consistent for all 20 devices in vanilla federated learning. So one obvious specialty shown by this figure is that counterintuitively, even for a legitimate learning device, there is always a sharp accuracy drop when the device starts to perform the local model update only for 1 epoch. And these purple arrows can describe such an accuracy drop with their drop range. And our method was to approximate AW last G minus AW LW. Here, since every device performed 5 local epochs and uploaded their local model updates, LW is actually LW parentheses 5. So such calculation can be described by these red arrows. It is observed that this difference is increasing as the communication round progressed, at least for these 10 communication rounds. And it was hard to catch this pattern. Instead, we had found an alternative. Instead of looking at those pink sharp accuracy drop, which are the red arrows, you can see these two are exactly the same, which are the red arrows in the previous slide. Instead, we may look at this local accuracy change circled in green. Previously, we hypothesized that if a local model update was legitimately learned, it should produce some accuracy boost or suffer from a little bit of accuracy loss, which are actually very close to the trend of these local accuracy changes, right? See here, the local accuracy boosts a bit, and here local accuracy suffers from a little bit lost. So inspired by this observation, we proposed a new validation method, which was to let the validator perform a single epoch of local training to get LV parenthesis 1 as the proxy value evaluation of LW1. Then the validator calculates AVLV1 minus AVLW to approximate this AWLW1 minus AWLW. And we again, we denote this difference as VED. Then the validator could vote for this local update by comparing this VED value with its validator threshold value, which is an accuracy drop tolerance, local accuracy drop tolerance, subjectively set by V. Therefore, the hypothesis here is that when the validator uses LV1 to approximate LW1, he or she is assuming the worker W is legitimately updating its model for the first local epoch, because V would regard him or herself as a legitimate learner at this moment, right? Therefore, if W is indeed doing legitimate update, this VED value should be within some reasonable range. And this range is limited by this validator threshold value. Suppose the VED exceeds this limit, which means it produces a high local accuracy drop. Under the premise that V assumes that W is legitimately learning the first epoch, in that case, V proves by contradiction that W is not doing legitimate learning. Okay. So any questions so far? Okay. And if we now take a look back at the validation method I introduced earlier for W2 and V1 that was at the beginning, these two are exactly the same. This is a more generic implementation, and this can be sent as an example from this method. Okay, so the core value is just to compare their local accuracy change. And if the accuracy change drops too much, exceeds the tolerance of validator, then validator thinks this worker is malicious. That's the core idea behind it. So now a question remains is how we should determine the validator threshold value VH. At that time, one thing we could do is to find the pattern of the VED value through experiments in order to determine the validator threshold value, because it is a limit. It is a limit for this VED value. It restrains this value. Accordingly, we ran Vbfl with 20 devices, in which 17 are legitimate devices and 3 are malicious devices, which is 15% of the 20 devices, right? We chose 3 malicious devices because in our previous vanilla federated learning experiment, 15% of malicious learning devices are enough to poison the global model effectively, as you may recall by this blue curve from this first figure earlier, right? So the setting for the malicious device is when they became workers, they would inject Gaussian noise to their legitimately learned model update before uploading them to the validator to simulate the distorted local model update. For simplicity, the malicious devices completely follow the rules when they became validators or miners. So now here we assume miners and validators are not compromised when a malicious device became that rule. And for another simplicity, we hard assigned an arbitrary combination of 12 workers, 5 validators, and 3 miners in Vbfl through the learning processes. We wanted the worker to be the majority and wanted the miner to be as few as possible. So we ended up with this combination. Notice that fixing this row combination did not violate the row switching policy, because The implementation of this is to shuffle the device list at the beginning of a communication round and assign the device's role in order based on this combination. So here is 12, 3, and the remaining value, 5. So it did not violate that role switching policy. Lastly, all the learning parameters followed the vanilla federated learning experiments used to plot the previous learning curve, such as the network architecture, learning rate, and the local epochs, which is 5. And the network architecture is MCN. And we logged the VED value for every possible pair of worker and validators through all communication rounds. Here is the plot showing that for the first 30 communication rounds of this Vbfl execution, the x-axis is the communication round, and the y-axis indicates the VED value. And recall that VED value is the difference of these two accuracy values. Since the execution was an emulation, we could know beforehand whether a validator was validating a model from a malicious device or a legitimate device, right? Which means the worker is malicious or legitimate. The red dots represented the VED value when LW was from a malicious worker. And the green dots represent this VED value from a legitimate worker. And we said that if VED is larger than the threshold value, the validator should cast a negative vote. This plot shows an almost consistent conclusion to this validation mechanism, because if we look at this VED equals to 0.08 line, the majority of the malicious nodes reside above this line. So if we set this VH value to be 0.08 as the baseline of distinguishing malicious devices from legitimate devices or workers, the validators could effectively identify majority of them, right? This y-axis is VED value, and if this line is VH. So going forward, we implemented this voting mechanism and set the validator threshold value to be 0.08 without changing other experimental setups. And the devices would only use the positively voted local updates for their final global updates, and they will discard the negatively voted local model updates. So then we would be able to produce this green curve compared to the blue curve, showing the same ratio of malicious devices learning in vanilla federated learning. The accuracy boost can be as big as 7.7 times if you do the calculation. However, we admit one limitation here. The choice of validator threshold value is based on examining the emulation logs. But in contrast, in real practical system, the validator devices do not have this ability. Also, the choice of validator threshold value may be affected by the number of participating devices, the dataset used, number of local epochs, and many other factors. So our next attempt is to see whether a legitimate validator could learn the VED value through its historical record of local accuracy change when it was a worker in previous rounds, as these would give the validator a sense of the legitimate local accuracy change. Also, this could be learned adaptively as the communication round progresses, so the validator can change this value along the way to better fit the voting process. Okay, and as the result, a thorough study of the choice of validator threshold value is deferred to the future work. That is the first part. That is the voting mechanism. Any questions? Okay. Why I have this slide? Oh, yes. And there is one more thing to be discussed. It is that what if the signature of a worker transaction is not verified? Well, in the current implementation, the validator would simply cast an empty vote for it. So later, the miner does not need to aggregate this voting result. Under the current implementation, a validator cannot be certain if it is the worker or the broadcasting validator, or even the links among them that get compromised to make this signature invalid. So a more advanced judgment mechanism is deferred to the future work. And in this work, to be simple, let's assume every transaction's signature is valid. Okay. So now we are done with the first part. Let's go to voting results aggregation by the miners. Because time is tight now, I will go over them quickly. Let's still take LW2 as an example. Assume that these are the votes for LW2 by the 4 validators, totally 3 positive votes and 1 negative vote. So remember, the validator would receive a reward for verifying the signature of the worker transaction. Here, they also receive a validation reward for voting on LW2. Then, like workers, validators sign these 5 fields and produce a signature as the 6th field, and encapsulate these 6 fields in a validator transaction. And they will send this transaction to their associated miners. In order to do so, like workers, the validators would also have to associate with some miners at the beginning of a communication round. Also notice that the validators are doing those actions asynchronously, such as associating voting and sending validator transactions, because this is a decentralized distributed system. The animation seems the validators are doing them together, but not. So I just want to be clear. Okay, so assume V1 and V2 they are associated with M2, V3 and V4 associated with M3. They will send their respective validator transaction to their corresponding miners. Also, the miners after the miners received the validator transactions, like validators, they would broadcast the received validator transaction to each other, so that each miner has the voting result from every validator for this LW2 contained within the worker transaction W2, WTXW2. Now, since every miner has all 4 validator transactions, they could verify the signature and get a verification reward, extract their voting results, and aggregate them. In this case, assume they are all legitimate and follow the rule, aggregation rule. They will all get 3 positive and 1 negative vote for LW2. Now, if you recall the original worker validator association, each worker would send its worker transaction to their respective associated validator, and the validators vote and send the validator transactions to their respective associated miners. Here we make a strong assumption. We assume that the link between any pair of the device is stable enough to not lose any package, and all the transactions can arrive in time. Well, in practice, we have to set some timeout mechanism for waiting for the transactions. So under this assumption, the aggregated voting results for each worker's local model update from each miner is exactly the same. And let's assume those are the aggregated voting results for the respective 5 worker local updates. At this moment, we are done explaining the second part, and we will explain the third part later, but not now. So to be continued, miners put those aggregated voting results with the respective validator transactions that contain those voting results into their respective candidate block. Because all 3 miners have the same aggregated voting results and the validator transactions, the content of their candidate blocks are the same at this moment. Then, any question? Then assume the waiting time for the validator transactions ends at the miner side. Each miner would then begin to mine this block, which is to first hash the content of the previous block. Hash the content of the previous block and put the hash into its candidate block, and then put their public key inside of the block, and then hash the content the content of their entire candidate block content, and then use the miner's private key to sign the hash. And lastly, a miner add this signature to the block as well. The hashing operation here is equivalent to zero difficulty POW mining, as it doesn't require any leading zeros to be included in the hash. So it should be fast. Now the block content will be become different because their public key and signature are different. So in this slide, we only show M2, but the same procedure goes for M1 and M3 as well. After a miner mines its block, the miner needs to propagate its block to other miners in the network. A miner has a candidate block set, which will include its unmined block and the propagated block from the other miners. Suppose a timer for waiting for the propagated block ends now. The miner would then pick the legitimate block from the candidate block site. Now comes the importance of Vbfl Pos. According to Vbfl Pos, a miner has to pick the block mined by the miner that possesses the most stake among the assigned miners. As mentioned before, the reason is the miner with the most stake must have made a bigger contribution to the network by performing more legitimate local updates than other assigned miners. So this miner is deemed the most trustworthy among all the assigned miners. Also remember, each device has a stake tracker, and the miners now can use this tracker to see which miner has the most stake. The devices would update their stake tracker when they are processing the block, which I will cover later. Assume each miner has the same stake tracker as they had been honestly updating their blockchains with no forking events, and a forking event will be explained later as well. And their stake tracker shows that M2 has the most stake among all the miners. Then, if they are being honest, they would all pick M2 to append to their own blockchain, right? This is their blockchain and append the block 2. And then miner would send back block 2 to their associated workers and the validators for them to process this block. This association was mentioned before. Now, if you are familiar with blockchain operations, you must have heard about forking events, which refers to the situation when different devices receive different blocks. And that can happen in Vbfl by at least the following 4 possibilities. In Vbfl, since a block contains the local model updates for constructing the global model, a forking event happens in a real distributed system may cause their global model to be out of sync. Different blocks may contain different local model updates due to their various link strength among different devices. Therefore, we need to avoid it as much as possible, or their global model will go out of sync. So first situation is a dishonest node, like M3 here. Say it only has a total stake of 20. So probably M3 is a malicious device, a malicious miner. So M3 might put some bogus voting results and fabricate the worker and the validator transaction and send this block back to V1, V3 and V4. So V3 and V4 will append the wrong block instead of the legitimate block. Here is the forking. Second is 2 nodes may happen to have the same highest stake, like M1 and M2 all have 999. In this case, M1 and M2 will definitely favor its own block, while M3 happens to favor M1. Maybe it will choose M2 as well, but who knows, right? And due to previous chain fork, the rewards record could be different in their newly appended block. Yes, so the stake information is out of sync as well. So in M1 stake tracker, M3 has the highest. In M2, M1 is the highest. In M3 stake tracker, M2 is the highest. As a result, different nodes sends out different stake. So this is a very extreme situation. The fourth possibility is the timeout caused by the long transmission delay. let's assume that those links in dashed lines are not very stable, and the propagated block along these 3 links took forever to arrive. So finally, these 3 miners end up with different candidate block sets, although they have the same stake tracker. They could still pick the different block because of the candidate block set. A solution to forking is chain resync, which is already a very common solution for forking events, such as in POW, nodes would resync to the longest chain in the network to respect the mining work. So under Vbfl Pos, at the beginning of each communication round, no matter what role a device becomes, the device would do a chain resync before it performs its jobs. Under Vbfl Pos, a node will replace its chain if it finds a valid chain in which the blocks add up to a more minor stake than its own chain. The valid chain means each hash pointer must be correctly hashed to its previous block. Now, if we have a dishonest node, as long as there are some miners are sending the correct legitimate block, the chain resyncing will help replace the chain with the wrong block at the beginning of the next round. The second situation is more tricky. However, it is still possible that some nodes would not be able to append a new block due to the miner has a different previous block than the devices now have. So the hash pointer does not match. Therefore, these devices will be forced to not appending a new block after forking and will be able to resync its chain the next round. So it's 2 rounds after forking. The previous chain fork is very similar to the same highest stake situation, where these nodes may be forced to resync their chain at a later round. And if timeout happens, the node will probably find a chain that adds up to more stake, so they will resync to that new chain. We have this resyncing mechanism implemented, but we have not tested these situations due to time constraint. So it is our belief that it should work theoretically. Its final report will be deferred to future work. Okay, now we are at the last phase, which is processing the appended block. From the title, we know that a device would process its block only after it appends to its own blockchain, because that would first secure the data structure. So for a miner, it will process the appended block at the same time of requesting its associated devices to download. And for workers and validators, they would first verify if this block has a valid signature and a valid hash and a valid previous block hash. If they are all valid, the worker or the validator would append this block to its blockchain and start processing it. Block processing includes these 3 important things, which are first, they will use only the positively voted local model updates for global model update. And second, they will update their stake tracker. And at the last, which is also the third part of validation mechanism, they would do blacklisting. So let's take a look at this Vbfl global model update. Suppose there is no forking event. There was no forking event, and this is the block that every device appended. Then each device should use only LW1, LW2, and LW4 for global model update, as they have the positively they have the positive votes no less than the negative votes. As a result, LW3 and LW5 might have W3 and W5 might have brought low quality data sets or purposely uploaded distorted model updates. So compared to vanilla federated learning, assume these 5 learning devices uploaded the same local model updates, then the new global model, new G prime, sent back by the central server would involve LW3 and LW5, which has a high chance that its quality is not as good as new G constructed under Vbfl global model update. Next thing is to do next thing is to update the stake tracker. It will be very fast. It's approaching the end. Yes, I apologize. Previously, I forgot to add the minus verification rewards inside of M2's block, so I added it here. But it should appear in all previous figures as well. So simply speaking, this block has all validator transactions in which the expected to be granted rewards for the validators to the validators can be recognized at this moment. Also notice that each validator transaction has a worker transaction encapsulated, in which the expected to be granted rewards for the workers can be recognized at this moment as well. I think we haven't finished. And yes, and lastly, we have the minor rewards for verifying the signature of validator transactions, RM2. You may recall how workers calculate their respective rewards. And now is the time to decide if these rewards will be granted. The rewards will only be granted to the worker if their local model updates are positively voted in their finally aggregated voting rewards. This capital N plus means the number of positive votes, and the N minus means the number of negative votes. So in this case, only R1, R2, and R4 will be granted to W1, W2, and W4 because they are positively voted. For validators, their expected rewards will just be granted as long as they are recorded in the block. And same thing for miners, RM. Notice here, we only reward the winning miner, because it is the only miner rewards recorded in the block. So if you compare these three rewarding mechanisms, you could observe that Vbfl Pos rewards legitimate workers heavily, but validators and miners only get the rewards that are the counts, the number of counts of how many verifications or validations they are doing. For example, one legitimate worker could encapsulate 500 rewards in a worker transaction. However, verifying this only worker transaction or validating this local model update only gives one reward to the validator, and verifying a validator transaction gives the miner only one reward. The jobs of the validator and the miners are more like an obligation to keep Vbfl running, while they can earn high rewards when they become a worker, honest worker in the future ones. Rewarding heavily on legitimate workers can make them stand out when picking the legitimate block. Also, we reward the worker proportionally to their number of training samples and the local epochs to incentivize the workers to bring more training data and perform more local epochs to help the learning process converge faster, if not overfitting. Okay, lastly, let's talk about blacklisting rule. So in this step, the blacklisting tracker and blacklist will be used by each device. So as LW3 and LW4 are negatively voted, so worker 3 and worker 4, this is a typo. So worker 3 and worker 5 will be treated as potentially malicious for this communication round. Devices will add an X to the corresponding device's ID in their block listing tracker. Let's assume that a device has to be consecutively identified for 4 rounds in order to be blacklisted, and we denote this number as KICR. If a device A marks as X by a device B, if device A marks an X for device B, device A will check if device B satisfies KICR. In this case, device B is worker 3 and worker 5. And unfortunately, worker 3 has been consecutively identified as malicious for 4 consecutive rounds. So worker 3 will be blacklisted. But worker 5 is still fine at this moment. So append worker 3's device ID to blacklist. Once a device is blacklisted, the other device will refuse to associate with the blacklisted device, and will also refuse to append a block mined by the blacklisted device. By doing so, we not only completely ban it from continuously threatening the global model, but also we reduce the block size and cut down the transmission delay of the block, making the system a little bit more efficient. So after a device has processed its appended block, the device is ready to start a new communication round, and its role would get randomly reassigned equally to one of the 3 rows. After we have gone through the overall operations, the benefits of row switching policy becomes more evident. First, because workers are reassigned each round, so in the long run, each training set will have a chance to be learned. And this is very close to the vanilla federated learning. And this is also related to a question previously asked. Similarly, each test set will be used for validation in the long run as well. Since minors are reassigned in each communication, in each new round, a node with the highest stake in the entire network cannot be necessarily selected as a winning miner continuously. So this will mitigate the POS monopoly. In practice, we need to design a mechanism to make sure devices randomly reassign their roles, rather than just choose the role they want to be. And just because of this role switching policy, a worker can be a miner later, and the rewards it earned as a worker can be used to help it become a winning miner, making the Vbfl Pos winning miner selection possible. Okay, finally, we get to the experimental results section, and we will cover these results by some plots. So first, let's take a look at the effectiveness of the validation mechanism of Vbfl. So we ran the following 5 experimental setups for 3 executions per each, and plotted the global accuracy across all 100 communication routes. The data sets used were still MNIST. For each setup, we still have 20 devices. And for Vbfl, we always have 12 workers, 5 validators, and 3 miners. The solid line in the middle of the shaded area represents the mean value of the accuracy, and the upper bound and the lower bound of the shaded area represent the mean plus and minus the standard deviation. The orange line with the shaded area is for vanilla federated learning with all 20 legitimate devices. And the green line with the shaded area is for Vbfl Pos with all 20 legitimate devices. And the validator threshold is set to 1.0, which means that the validators would always vote positive for all the local updates sent to it, which is true, by the way. So we draw these 2 lines to show the situation of ideal federated learning when there was no malicious device. And most importantly, you may observe these 2 lines are almost overlapped, indicating that the decentralized federated learning works well in Vbfl. Although only 12 workers were doing local model updates each round, with the role switching policy, the whole MNIST dataset could be learned in the long run. Okay, now let's see the effects of model validation. The red line with the shaded area represents the global accuracy with 3 out of 20 malicious devices involved in the vanilla federated learning. And the blue line with shaded area represents the global accuracy when 3 out of 20 devices, malicious devices involved in Vbfl with validator threshold 0.08. If we compare the blue line with the red line, we observe that the validation mechanism in Vbfl is able to discard the distorted local model updates effectively, as the learning accuracy boosted from the red line to the blue line, and tries to approach the orange or the green line as much as possible. However, there is roughly a 10% of accuracy trade-off, which may be because 15% of the MNIST training set was never adequately learned because they put the injected noise to their global model, to their local model. Lastly, we want to show the effects of decentralized voting by comparing the blue line and the magenta line. So this answers the question of Professor Tong: if a validator is compromised, then what happens? So in this magenta line experimental setup, when a malicious device became a validator, it would flip its voting result after following the legitimate voting mechanism, and this is the only difference compared to the blue line. MV means malicious validator. it is observed that these two lines almost overlap with each other as well. Sorry, meaning that although there may be rounds that validators were compromised, the overall validation process was not impacted that much because we had more than one validator and they were not able to restrain each other, right? Therefore, the voting is decentralized and the vote won't be destroyed if only a few of validators were compromised. Okay, so we can quickly go through this as well. So in order to compare POW with Vbfl Pos, we implemented the mining operations for POW and simulated the transmission delay of transactions and block. And we tracked the SRC time, which is short for the slowest round completion time, which means the time taken for the slowest device at the communication round to complete that communication round. We ran POW with difficulty 1 and 2, and we borrowed the tracked time log in the previous 3 Vbfl Pos executions with validator threshold 0.8. The first figure shows the accumulated SRC time for all 5 setups, and a dot in the second figure means that a forking event happened at that communication round, and a cross means that there was no valid block mined in that round, most likely due to all miners were blacklisted. We can see for POW D1, that is this green line is very overlapping here. Its accumulated SRC time is comparable to all 3 POS rounds. However, figure 2 shows that it has a lot of forking due to the mining taking too short time, and that is not ideal at all. For difficulty 2, the forking events are much less. However, its accumulated SRC time is too long. So for Vbfl Pos, it takes less SRC time, and also it has very few forking events, which is comparable to POW difficulty 2. In my opinion, with the rule switching, the stick of devices will become more diverse in the long run. Therefore, the probability of a forking event decreases as the round progresses. We can see the effectiveness of Vbfl Pos miner selection by comparing it with the miner selection of POW, because POW does not rely on stick to pick the winning miner. So in this first figure, a dot represents a malicious device was selected as the winning miner at their communication round. It is observed that our POS miner selection works surprisingly well by never picking a malicious device as the winning miner across all 100 communication rounds. Well, for both POW executions, there were some events for that. And to see it more concretely, we plot the stick accumulation curve for all 20 devices in all 5 setups. The green lines show the stick curves of legitimate devices, and the red lines show that for malicious devices. We can see that the stick of malicious devices stops increasing in an early stage because all 5 setups have the validation method implemented. I forgot to mention that kick R is set to 6, so probably some malicious devices got kicked out early. But although these stopped increasing early in both POW rounds, there were still events. A malicious device was selected as the winning miner. So POW does not take advantage of this stick information, what POS does. Okay, in conclusion, although Vbfl shows some promising results, but it is still in its emulation stage. So there may be challenging when deploying it to the real distributed system. And there are many factors that may potentially impact the validation mechanism, such as the dataset use, the local epochs, the learning rate, and the different role combination, and so on. These are yet to be tested. And there are many other current research directions to be expected, such as using other machine learning algorithms with Vbfl, rather than just a neural network. But overall, to our best knowledge, Vbfl is probably the first POS-based federated learning framework. And also we have an open source emulation, which can be found at my GitHub. Okay, that's all of my presentation.